So it's my opportunity now to introduce our two speakers. Mark Johnson, you probably could guess which is Mark, has been a partner at Denton's U.S. LLP since 1994 when he helped found the Denton's Kansas City office. Prior to that, he had been at Spencer Fane Britton Brown since 1980, first as an associate, then as a partner. His practice is concentrated on the areas of the First Amendment, employee relations, and election law and campaign finance. He has been listed in every edition of Best Lawyers in America since 1995 and has been selected by that publication in 3 areas: First Amendment, public utility, and energy. In addition to teaching courses on election law and First Amendment at the University of Kansas Law School, Mark teaches undergraduate courses on the First Amendment, ethics, and privacy in KU's journalism school, and a freshman seminar on election campaigns in KU's honor programs. In his practice, Mark advises political candidates, issues on campaigns, and super PACs, and perhaps also League of Women Voters, when we might need his help. Cille King is sitting next to him. Cille, I'm excited to say, is the co-president of the Kansas League of Women Voters. Came over this morning from Lawrence. She and I talked this week. She had a very demanding time. I just want you to know she picked up her materials and her purse and her car keys and drove to Fort Hays on Wednesday to help them at the university start a voter engagement campaign. Come back, and then last night she did a presentation over at KU for a sorority on voting. So, thank you, Cille. She shares the leadership with Teresa Biggs of the Emporia League. The League of Women Voters of Kansas is a grassroots volunteer organization with 9 local leagues, we are included, across the state. Elected boards consisting of officers and directors govern LWVK, League of Women Voters Kansas, and each local league. The 2 terms of state board members are staggered. The League of Women Voters Board meets monthly, alternating between conference calls and in-person meetings around the state. I believe I can say that our treasurer, Anita, is also the treasurer for the state league, if I have that correct. Is anyone else here on the board? Ellen, are you on the board of the state league? So, with that, I'm going to turn it over to our 2 speakers. Please welcome Mark Johnson.
Oh, I go first.
By the way, I know how they do. We had a major event a couple weeks ago with the league from Missouri, and we couldn't get one of the slides to work either.
Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning.
That's an amazing response. 9:19. Well, actually, I have 2 minutes. I'm always 2 minutes fast, so it's 9:17 in the morning. It's wonderful to be here. This is actually the second time I've had the opportunity to speak to your group. A couple of years ago, I was here with with representatives of the Kansas Republican and Kansas Democratic parties. I guess I was the You can't hear. How's that? All right. I guess at that point I was the nonpartisan referee or something like that. But it is a privilege to speak to a group such as the League of Women Voters, which performs an absolutely amazing role in our political system, not just here in Kansas, but throughout the entire country. I was interested to hear that Cille was in Hays, I assume at Fort Hays State, helping set up first a voter registration program. I'd like to think that your group is now back in the business of voter registration drives, at least in part due to the result that we obtained in the voting rights case here in Kansas Federal Court this past June, after having tried this case in March. In fact, I recognize a few of you from having been at the trial. I was the lead counsel in that case. It's now on appeal to the 10th Circuit, and we're hoping that we will hold on to that opinion. Then we'll see what happens at the Supreme Court with it. But for the moment, to register to vote in Kansas, you don't need to demonstrate with a piece of paper that you're actually an American citizen. Most people don't walk around carrying their birth certificates or passports. And so now that's why voter registration drives can finally kick back into operation in Kansas. Unfortunately, we hadn't had them for a while. Let me talk about what I'm supposed to talk about, and that is the concept of a constitutional convention. It's actually provided for in the Constitution. And this would be, if it came to pass, the second time we've had this happen in U.S. history. The first, of course, occurred over the summer of 1787 in Philadelphia, when the Constitution that we now use was written. And I left mine over there. Sorry. But you all know what it is. It consists only of 7 articles. It's perhaps the shortest foundational document of any country in the world. Most countries that have constitutions, they run to hundreds, if not thousands, of pages. In the United States, our Constitution, as it was originally published, was only 4 pages long. Big pages, but only 4 pages long. 7 articles, as I mentioned, but what we're going to talk about today is Article 5. And Article 5 describes the process to be used to amend the Constitution. In 1787, when the delegates to the Constitutional Convention met in Philadelphia, there were at any one time over the course of the summer between 40 and 60 of delegates in attendance. They met in secret. Many people don't know that. Ostensibly, they were going to Philadelphia to amend the Articles of Confederation, which had been adopted in 1781, and by 1787, to most informed citizens in the United States, the Revolutionary War now behind us, the Articles were a complete and utter disaster. The country simply could not function. When it came down to it, it was for one principal reason. Every state had to agree on something in order for it to be adopted. You wanted to impose a tax on something, all 13 states had to agree. You wanted to impose a new tariff or reduce tariffs, all 13 states had to agree. And as we all know, and I only have 2 children, I can't get my 2 daughters to agree on anything. Imagine trying to get 13 states to agree. So in 1786, Alexander Hamilton, and it was his brainchild, came up with the idea of getting people together the next year to see what could be done. And he decided the thing to do was, let's try this all over again. But they didn't tell anybody. The delegates met, as I said, in Philadelphia in secret for 5 months, from May through September. Imagine Philadelphia in the summer, in a closed room, wearing those heavy woolen suits. I can't imagine what it must have been like. But in any case, they stuck it out, and by September of 1787 had agreed on what would be a new foundational document for the United States. They issued it to the states for ratification. And again, the ratification process is something described in the Constitution. And by 1788, a sufficient number of states, 9, had ratified the Constitution. So at least in those 9 states it went into effect. And then it went into effect as each of the other, at that time, 4 states ratified it. Ironically, Rhode Island always seemed to be the last in doing anything, and they were the last to ratify, and in fact didn't ratify the Constitution until after the Bill of Rights had been ratified. But in any case, Article 5 describes 2 methods for amending the Constitution. The one with which we're familiar is the one that's been used for all 27 times that the Constitution has been amended since it was adopted. Oh my gosh. Thank you so much. Your timing is perfect.
I don't know what's going on with that keystone,
Let's go to the next slide.
Okay, all right, next slide. Here we go. All right, hold on.
All right, so...
Is that it?
Well,
I'm going to work this
for the
out.
folks in the back, maybe you can
Okay.
raise it up a little bit.
And I'm going to work on
That
that
would be helpful.
keystoning. I'm sorry. Yeah.
And I'm sure that we can post this on the league's website, so you can all look at this. It's a short PowerPoint presentation. It's an interesting aesthetic. There we go. Oh, that's easy. All right, so Article 5 describes the two processes to be used. The first, which we're probably all familiar with, requires that a proposed amendment be adopted by 2/3 majorities in both the U.S. Senate and the U.S. House of Representatives. And then it goes to the states for ratification. And you have to have 3/4 of the states ratify an amendment. The purpose of this was to make sure that the Constitution could be amended, but it would be difficult. So you couldn't have willy-nilly changes as the political winds blew back and forth. That you have to have near unanimity in order for the foundational document on which we all rely to be changed. So the initial 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights, and then the next 17 amendments, which have been adopted over the course of U.S. history, have all utilized a process where Congress would, by 2/3 majorities, propose the amendments to the states, and then the states would ratify them. But there's a second process for amending the Constitution, and that's what we're talking about here today. That's a convention called by the states. If 2/3 of the states, so if 2/3 of the states apply to Congress by essentially passing legislative resolutions. And so these are resolutions that would be passed by the state legislatures, both houses, for 49 of the states, and the one house of the legislature in Nebraska. Nebraska having a unicameral legislature. Doesn't have to be signed by the governor, so it's not like a normal piece of legislation. So it's a resolution adopted by the state legislatures that applies to the U.S. Congress for the calling of a constitutional convention. Then the convention meets, and as I'll show you in a few moments, there really isn't much in terms of authority as to what that convention would consist of. But once the convention meets, then it would discuss and propose amendments to the Constitution that would be then sent to the states for ratification, requiring the 3/4 majority as the first process for ratification requires. Okay, so next. Thank you. Well,
I got it. Don't worry. It's going to happen.
Oh,
Don't worry.
we'll get to it. In the last, some people think that the call for a constitutional convention is something that has just arisen in the past few years. In fact, many legislatures since the early 1900s have adopted resolutions. There we go.
Is that it? Okay.
That's it, great. Have adopted resolutions asking the Congress to call a convention, but they never got the required 2/3 majority in order for Congress to call the convention. In fact, some of you may remember in the 1970s and into the early 1980s, there was actually a movement to try to call a constitutional convention to adopt a balanced budget amendment. Maybe about a dozen states went along with that, but it died. In the past, can we go back one? I'm sorry.
It's slow. That's what's happening. It's
Oh,
just so
okay.
damn slow.
All right.
Yeah. I'm so sorry.
No,
that
that's okay.
Just a slow, there you go. It's just
Okay.
very slow.
So, what's been happening the past few years? There are two principal groups calling for a constitutional convention. The first is called, the group is called the Convention of States. They have a website, conventionofstates.com. And this group is calling for a constitutional convention whose essential purpose would be to, by amending the Constitution, limit the power and jurisdiction of the federal government. The idea that this group is advocating is essentially that the federal government is too large, it has too much power, it can tax us at its discretion, and can spend our money at its discretion, and that should be reined in. You know, that those congressional powers should be reined in. For example, the Convention of States, among the topics that it believes should be considered by the Constitutional Convention, that includes a balanced budget amendment, reducing the federal spending power by, as they put it, fixing the general welfare clause. Some of you may know that Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution is the so-called enumerated powers clause. It lists all of the things that the federal government can do and the states can't do. Operate the mails, print money, currency, and so forth. All sorts of powers that the federal government has. And this group is, among other things, calling for a reduction in those powers. They want to prohibit the use of international law in the United States. They want to limit the use of executive orders to enact laws. They want to impose checks and balances on the Supreme Court, including the possibility of term limits on justices at the Supreme Court. And they also are talking about placing a limit on federal taxation. So that's this one group. The second group is called the Wolf Pack. And the PAC at the end of it indicates that it's a super PAC. And if you want to know what a super PAC is, I can talk for a couple of hours about that, and I will only be scratching the surface. Wolf Pack's goal is a simple one, at least at first blush. They want to reverse the Supreme Court's decision in Citizens United. And that was the case that many people believe allowed for the introduction of dark money into our political system. That's an overly simplistic view of the case, but that's what most people think of it, and that's what this group wants to get rid of. Probably would require an amendment to the First Amendment, which would be an interesting exercise. Okay, so next.
It's slow, but it'll happen.
Okay, we'll catch up. The next two slides are maps showing how far this effort has gone. About 27 or 28 states, there's some disagreement about that, have passed resolutions asking for a constitutional convention to adopt a balanced budget amendment. In other words, an amendment that would require the federal government to operate with a balanced budget. Many of the state governments have that limitation on their powers imposed by the state constitutions, but there's no such limitation on the federal government for that, and that's one reason that we can and we do run such large deficits. And the reason that I say that there's a little bit of disagreement as to how many states have called for this is that some of the states that adopted resolutions asking for a convention on this issue, either they placed a limit on the number of years their application would last, or they have affirmatively voted subsequently to pull back on that application. And there's some question as to whether the rescission of an application for a constitutional convention is something that could be effective. In other words, this whole exercise is sort of embarking into unknown waters. We don't have rules, we don't have laws that apply to this constitutional convention, so we're really not sure if a legislature can say, we've changed our mind, we withdraw our application. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So that's the balanced budget amendment. The next slide comes from the Convention of States website, from this group, and it shows when we get to it. It shows their progress report. There we go. And this looks a little confusing, and I'll tell you what it means. It shows their progress report on how the resolution asking for, in essence, a subject-based constitutional convention. In other words, they're not talking about proposing specific amendments to be adopted by this convention. They're calling for the convention to meet to discuss the subject of reducing federal powers, and after that discussion, then propose amendments to the states. So what we have here, if you look in green, and that's 12 states, those states have passed the Convention of States resolution. In other words, both houses of the legislatures have passed it, and so they've made a formal request to Congress to hold this convention. The states in blue, states in yellow, one house of the state legislature has passed this resolution, and that's 10 in total. There are 12 that have passed it in toto. In other words, 12 states in green, 10 in yellow, and the states that are in blue have what they call active legislation. Interestingly, they have Kansas here in blue. Now, this shows that their map is a little bit behind the curve because just this past spring, the Kansas State House adopted the resolution, but it died in the Kansas Senate because the Kansas Senate killed it on a 22-16 vote. They needed a two-thirds vote. Remember, you have to have a two-thirds majority in each house of the legislature. And in the Kansas State Senate, 22 senators voted for it, 16 against. Of course, there are 40 senators in Kansas, so there were 2 that didn't vote. But because they needed 28 votes to adopt it, it died. Now, one thing that Ellen asked us to address is what you could do about this. One thing I can tell you is that the Convention of States has said that they intend to come back to the Kansas legislature in the next session. And of course, we'll have an intervening election. And so we'll have presumably a different composition in the state Senate coming next spring. Finally, the states in white, no active legislation, or they've totally killed it one way, one of those two. Okay, next. I feel like I should tell a joke.
It feels bad. I'm so sorry. It's so slow.
Okay, that's okay. Here, while we're waiting for the next slide, let me tell you that one of the things that I've done in my career is I've done some political advance work. So when there's an appearance by a candidate giving a speech or something like that, I, from time to time, would help with the arrangements. The one cardinal rule that has to be followed in advance work is make sure the room is full. It doesn't matter how big the room is, it doesn't matter how small the room is. You make sure it's absolutely full. You make sure that there aren't enough seats for everybody. And I tell you, the league does good advance work. Okay, so the big question, and this is really it, can a constitutional convention be limited? And there's actually scholarly disagreement about that.
Of course.
Could a constitutional convention be limited to talking only about specific proposed amendments? Or, even if it appears that they've been called to only talk about specific things, they can sort of go off on their own. As we lawyers would call it, a roving commission. And there is really no agreement about that.
Ready?
Which means that there's a possibility of a convention that gets out of control. That they meet and they decide, yes, we've been told what we're supposed to talk about, but we're going to talk about some other things as well. Okay. The next one will be final one, and that is, should it be? I mean, should the Constitution be amended? It's only been done 27 times. You may think that's a lot, but in 240-odd years, about 1 every 10 years, of course the first 10 were adopted within the first 2 years. So it's really been 17 times in about 240 years. Not that often. whenever the Constitution is amended, the law of unintended consequences rears its head. So we may see discussions about what seems to be relatively simple. We need a balanced budget. Okay, but the thing is, what does that really mean? We won't know until it actually goes into effect. And then there's the fact that once we have a constitutional convention, it will be easier to have another one. So I'm not taking a position one way or another. I'm just hoping to educate you on this concept. And then I suspect that Cille will talk about more from an advocate's point of view. So let me turn it over to Cille now. And at the end, as Marcia said, as many questions as possible would be wonderful.
So you don't want the rest of this part up here?
Nope, that's it.
Okay.
I already talked about
I
it.
have a question for you.
Oh, no. Haven't any chance to sit down.
Yeah, I know. I have a question for you, though. And if you want to use that mic or this one.
I'll come over here.
Okay. Your map showed that Kansas has ratified, or at least... Your map shows that Kansas is one of the states that, and you said that the House ratified a resolution to have a constitutional amendment, or, excuse me, a constitutional convention. Can you tell us when that was?
Well, it was
You're good. You're good. Just
I'm
hold
good.
up.
It was in the past, within the past 2 years. Maybe it's 2017, maybe it's 2018. I can't remember exactly.
2016, it failed in the House. 2018, it failed in the Senate.
Okay, well,
Okay.
but they're going to be back.
We will.
Yeah.
Well, I was trying to do a little research on that question because I wondered, and I'd looked back in history, and the one place I found that Kansas had adopted a convention of the states was in 1909 for Kansas direct election of senators. And I could not find any other reference to when our legislature or House passed. Because as your audience is so well informed, in 2018 it came before, and Mark Johnson said, it came before the Senate and was not adopted on a yay of 22. You want to know who those senators were who voted yay? I have a list. Okay, it was Alley, these are just the last names, Alley, Baumgardner, Berger, Billinger, Bowers, Denning, Estes, Fitzgerald, Gibbons, Goddard, Hardy, Kirshen, Longbine, Lynn, Masterson, Olson, Peterson, Pilcher Cook, Solentrop, Tyson, Wagle, Wilbur. And those who voted no, Boiler, Pascudo, Francisco, Haley, Hawk, Hensley, Hildebrand, Kelly, McGinn, Petrie, I say that wrong, Pyle, Rogers, B. Smith, Scooble, Skaggs, and Taylor. And the two not voting were Dahl and Holland. So anyway, and going back to 2017, it died in committee in the House. 2015-16, not adopted in the House. And 2013-14, it died in committee. And that's all the farther back I could find, and except for that 1909 convention. So could that possibly be when that's still on the record, and that's what they're showing as how Kansas has partial constitutional convention approval?
I think that's the case, and that's why I believe that, I personally believe that the folks who are saying that either 27 or 28 states have called for a balanced budget, I really think it's a lower number than that, because I think at some point these things die.
Okay. But we are in agreement that this will probably come back up next session,
Yes.
this coming session. So this particular issue has not been one that the State League was looking closely at. You know, we have a lot of priorities on our voting rights list. Getting or removing from statute the voting or the SAFE Act, the need to provide proof of citizenship. So even though the courts overturned it for now, it's still on our statutes, and the only way to remove it is to actually have the legislature vote to remove it. And also maybe moderate the voter ID law. A lot of states that have voter ID have the provision that if somebody just can't get one for some reason, they can still sign a sworn affidavit that they are a citizen. Kansas does not have that. So we still have a few hundred every election that go through without a correct voter ID, and their votes aren't counted.
Can you please speak louder? It's very.
Yes, sir. Wait, she's
Okay,
on the
I'm
mic.
sorry.
Come up here.
So in voting rights, we'd like to see everybody be able to have a permanent advanced ballot. Right now, if you're not a disabled person that needs to have and will get a permanent advanced ballot, you have to apply every election for that advanced ballot to be sent to you. And we'd like to see that changed. And so there's a number of voting rights acts, including removing the Kansas Secretary of State appointment of election commissioners to the 4 largest counties. We think all of you ought to be able to have some say in who your election commissioner is, and not just have them be responsible to the Secretary of State. And I'm particularly interested in that because Douglas County, where I am, is closely approaching that 130,000 citizens, where we would also be subject to the Secretary of State appointing our election commissioner. And we love Jamie Shue. We do not want him. We do not want to lose him. So back to the constitutional amendment, though. We, as a State League, have not been focused on this. We do have legislative observers. I know we have at least one from Johnson County who comes to the legislature to look at various hearings. But ones that we have in Topeka who are more able and can respond faster are more focused on the school finance or taxation or the dismissal of the death penalty. And so our few members that we have that can attend these hearings, which sometimes we don't get a lot of notice on, and can change day to day, we have a limited number of people who can observe these things. And with our, as you know, we have one of the most secret governments in the nation. One of Kansas, the Kansas City Star did a report last January that Kansas ranks really low on transparency in government. So we, as I said, it's really hard to know day to day what's going to be heard, what's going to be voted on, how you've got to submit your testimony at least 24 hours in advance. So it's a difficult project. And if we have anybody in this audience who wants to volunteer to be more of an observer for the Kansas legislature, we'd love to have you join our efforts. But the state-based actions that we could take is providing testimony, citizen action. So all of you learning about this issue, and if you can share that information with your friends and your neighbors or other groups that you belong to, there you got citizen action.
educational materials. If we could put together something that could be put in a YouTube or in a electronic base that we could share, that'd be great too. The National League had, going on to national efforts, the National League had put together this webinar, Understanding the Dangers of a Constitutional Convention. And that was just in May of this year. So if you go to the national website, you can find this webinar. And I printed it out because these two lists, or these two pages, which aren't up there, are some of this national webinar. But the national is looking at partnerships to oppose this, legislative tracking, outreach, and education. And what can you do in your community? You can monitor and track legislation in your state, which we are asking you to do. Talk to your neighbors, talk to your legislators. Host house parties or forums, build grassroots opposition to this issue, and be ready to act. When I read you the names of all the senators who had voted for this, I don't know that you would get any of them to reverse their decision, because I believe all of them are ALEC-based or ALEC-involved legislators, and that is what they do. They are concerned about what corporations want. When these members who are also ALEC members go to the national ALEC conventions, they meet with corporations and write our legislation. And I just saw last week, were any of you at the Women for Kansas forum or convention in Wichita? Well, last week, the Women for Kansas had a convention in Wichita. And it was wonderful. They had Greg Pallas the night before talking about the best money democracy can buy, or the best democracy money can buy. And he, of course, is filing another lawsuit against our current Secretary of State. So that makes a few more. With, I don't know if you saw there's a person in Lawrence who filed for a General Steve Davis, and what the term is,
what he asked for was a special grand jury.
Grand jury
to look into an alleged failure of the Secretary of State's website to register some people.
Right. There was proof that the Secretary of State's website had been down for several days over many months. And people thought they were registering when they went on to vote. It turns out they weren't. So Stephen Davis is filing that against our current Secretary of State.
That's actually going to happen. The Supreme Court approved it just this past week.
Right. It is approved. It probably will not happen until after the election. Wow. So where was I? Just all the different things that go on in our government that are not transparent, that is another issue. In fact, our legislative observers put together a packet with 4 issues that they want to see happen. One is having the committee people elected by the House and the Senate, rather than appointed by the chairs or by the leadership. And one is that once you have a committee put together, whether it's the elections committee or the state and federal government committee or whichever, that those committee members can vote on which legislation they want to have before them and whether or not they want to have hearings on, and if they'll take a vote. Because right now, those committee chairs have complete power over what is heard in a hearing before the committee, and whether or not it comes up for a vote. So like when I had to speak in Concordia last week to a group, and I told them, you know, you have in your community the main person in charge of elections. There's Senator Elaine Bowers is from Concordia. She represents 13 states, 13 counties in the state. And she is the chair of the Senate Local Government Ethics and Elections. And she, even though the majority of her committee wanted to hear some of these voting rights bills, she would not let them come before the committee. And even if they did come before the committee for a hearing, she wouldn't let them go to a vote. So similarly, you have people in your community that have that power to decide what's going to happen. And all your legislatures, when you have forums with them, if you will ask them how they feel about opening up some of this secrecy in government and letting them tell you whether they will or they won't, reduce the number of gut-and-go bills, have more committees videotaped, and make it a rule that they can't change hearings quite so frequently. So I don't have a lot other right now. Just that we will, as a state, watch what we can on what might happen with the Constitutional Convention bill coming up in the next session. And we hope that it doesn't pass, and we'll work to make that not pass. But one other thing, in that convention last weekend in Wichita, the Kansas executive director of the ACLU spoke at that convention, and he said that, in his opinion, if it does go to a constitutional convention, there are no rules, and that anything could be brought up, and they could take our current Constitution and do away with it and start over. So that's his opinion, and I respect you're saying that there's some
Mike is
difference.
not a lawyer.
He's not a lawyer.
Well, no, I'm kidding. I'm joking, of course. I mean, one thing about...
Use your
I'm
mic. Turn on your mic.
Okay. I'm on the board of the... Okay, I'll stand up, thank you. I'm on the board of the Kansas ACLU, so I actually played a role in hiring Micah Kubik, who is doing a fantastic job. But, you know, and I didn't address this formally in what I said, but Micah may or may not be entirely correct about whether there are no rules. Nobody really knows. Nobody knows how many people would be in this convention. Nobody knows how they would be selected. Nobody knows whether it would be one state, each state having one vote, or whether it would be like the Congress, where the states essentially get their number of Congress people on the basis of population. No one knows, and then no one knows who will set the rules. Will Congress try to do it, or will the convention itself try to do it?
What about the 10th Amendment?
The 10th Amendment. You know what? I get the 9th and 10th always mixed up. And it's a good thing I have my Constitution here. 10th Amendment, is that the one that reserves it to the people?
That's the one.
Powers not delegated to the Constitution or are reserved respectively to the people. Or reserved to the states or to the people. That would seem to argue that it would be up to the convention to set its own rules. But that's all I can say. It would seem to argue that. No one knows.
Well, thank you, and we got a question?
Yes,
Could you,
What
have
is it
cards.
written?
what? Oh, you do have cards.
Yes,
Oh,
there-
sorry.
Do we have some questions that have come in that are...
Here's a card.
There's some.
I can't read this.
We are seeing Koch brothers aging. What is the future? Well, we know that one Koch brother has already delegate or passed his responsibilities on. So
I can't remember if it's David or Charles who's retired. It's one or the other. David's retired. By the way, let me just tell you one thing for purposes of fairness about the Koch brothers. We in the ACLU are partnering with the Koch brothers on justice reform. So it's a mixed bag when it comes to the Koch brothers, and just please understand that. Here's one question that I think is actually very interesting, and here, let me just read it. There are state-based efforts to replace the Electoral College with a national popular vote. How far along is that? Is it legal? There's a model piece of legislation that ALEC put together. Oh, goodness gracious. Actually, it wasn't ALEC, it was another group that would, for Electoral College purposes, require the states that adopt it to have their Electoral College votes awarded to the presidential candidate who wins the national popular vote. At first blush, given what happened in 2000 and what happened in 2016, that seems to make some sense. We want it's sort of American to want the person who got the most votes to win the election. But let me suggest something, and that is, and this is my personal feeling, that adopting this law, and a number of states have, I think it's into the double digits at this point, the law of unintended consequences would kick in. And if you think they ignore Kansas today, wait until you see a presidential campaign where they are only campaigning in population centers. New York, Philadelphia, Los Angeles, Chicago, Houston, Dallas, etc. They will ignore Kansas City. They will ignore Missouri. They'll ignore Kansas because we simply don't have enough people. They'll go to the places where there are lots of votes. They'll try to pile up pluralities in the heavy vote states. And if adopted by Kansas or Missouri, that would require that the electoral votes from Kansas and Missouri would be awarded to whichever candidate ignored Kansas and Missouri more. So just think about that when you hear about this legislation.
wouldn't it be,
You're on parallel, make it parallel to the floor.
Closer.
wouldn't it be that the candidates would focus on big cities
Yes.
and not necessarily big states?
Well, they'd focus absolutely on big cities, but I think they'd also focus on the higher population states. You look at a state like Pennsylvania, high population state, but really only has 2 high population centers. They'll probably go to places like State College, Pennsylvania, or Scranton, Pennsylvania, where there are concentrations of votes, but not necessarily the really large cities. But I do think they would really focus on the large cities. Wow, we have lots of questions.
Yeah, I had one.
What is
Oh, go ahead.
what is ALEC? ALEC is short for American Legislative Executive Conference, or something like that? Council. It is a conservative group that has specialized over the past 20, 25 years in building up support within state legislatures. And they write model legislations for the states to pass, and then have the legislators in those states whose support they have to propose the legislation and have the states adopt it. They are big proponents of the balanced budget amendment, for example.
And they're primarily funded by the Koch brothers. Okay, I had one. Who should members interested?
Can't hear. Well, parallel to the floor. Parallel. See, parallel to the floor. If you
Is that what
like
I
this,
did?
like this. Okay, parallel to the floor.
Close to your mouth.
Okay, who should members interested following this issue in the next Kansas legislative session contact? Well, they can contact me? Is that what you're asking? Or which legislators? I did have a thought, thinking first the question was which legislators they should follow. And we have 2 of those legislators, senators, who voted no on this last time up for statewide election. So if Marcy Francisco is elected for treasurer, or Vicki Smith is elected to this commission, insurance commissioner, we might want to figure out who's going to be appointed. People will be appointed to those positions, right? We might want to make sure that we get people appointed.
Right. The state senate is only up every 4 years, and this is not a state senate year.
Right.
So any state senator who's elected to a statewide position, such as Senator Schmidt or Senator Francisco, will have a senator appointed in this case, in her stead to fill out the unexpired term until 2020. Okay, here's a question. Why does Johnson County have an appointed election commissioner instead of allowing us to vote to vote? Under state statute, the Secretary of State has the power to appoint election commissioners, or election, the person who runs the county election office in counties that have, it's 130,000, isn't it? 130,000 or more people. Today, that's 4 counties. Sedgwick, let me get this right, Sedgwick, Shawnee, Johnson, and Wyandotte. Sorry, Wyandotte. And that's why Cille mentioned Jamie Shue in Douglas County, who is elected, but if Douglas County, and it inevitably will sometime in the near future, exceeds 130,000 in population, absent a change in the statute, then the Secretary of State will have the power to appoint the Douglas County election commissioner.
And we don't want that to happen. Okay, I had one, do you have any predictions about whether Kansas House and Senate, as currently comprised, would support having constitutional convention? Well, as we listed here, it's come up this last several years. There's been a proposal or a bill, I'm sorry, not a bill, it's always a resolution, so a House concurrent resolution or a Senate concurrent resolution, which does not need the governor's signature. And so far, these last few years, they haven't passed it. But I know we've lost a few of the moderates representatives in this primary, in this last primary. So it's hard to say what's going to be the makeup of our next House and whether or not they would be more supportive or not. We need everybody's vote. And so if you don't support that issue, you might want to not elect House representatives who support it.
Here's a question about the Convention of States. And it asks, what political values or agenda is threatened by the Convention of States? I'm not going to take a position on which values should or should not be viewed as valid. But what I can say is that the Convention of States group, its avowed purpose is to reduce federal power. And let me just make, and maybe here's a little editorial, personal editorial comment on that. In 1787, when the original Constitution was drafted, it was largely as a result of the fact that a state-based government simply wasn't working. If you think the Great Depression in the 1930s was bad, or the Great Recession that we suffered in 2008 through like 2010 was bad, it's nothing compared to the economic disaster that the country was facing in the 1780s. It was impossible to do business. The courts didn't function. The government wasn't functioning to a great degree because every single state had to agree on something. If we go back to a system that is somewhat like that, more like that certainly than what we have today, then we may face similar types of unintended consequences. If the states start to really assert powers that
we have, over the past 240 odd years, given to the federal government, then we may see a situation that we would sincerely regret. I'm not saying that that's inevitable, coming out of a constitutional convention, but it's a possibility. It's a possibility that the powers of the federal government would be so greatly reduced that it would be difficult for the country to function in the way that it functions today. As badly as it functions today, it could be worse.
I have a question. Role of the League of Women Voters Legislative Observers. Well, they are a group of people who have volunteered, just like all of us volunteer, to attend the hearings and write a short report. And some of them write long reports. And most of those that have been submitted this last session, or the last couple of sessions, I believe you can find on the state website, so lwvk.org, and you can go to the legislative page and see the reports that those observers have written. And again, we have some really fine observers. Galen Dale in Topeka worked as a finance officer for a company in Topeka, and he's retired, and he was going to all the hearings on the finance, taxation, and he was able to put together an informative piece of information to give to the legislature so that they would understand what they were voting on. It was really impressive.
I have one that goes on to four cards. I'm trying to.
I think it's 4 different questions.
Okay. If a convention of states went out of control and ran away, where would it go? How would 38 states pass anything far left or far right? I mean, that's a very good question, a very good observation, that if we had a convention that appeared to run away, would it still be able to propose amendments that 3/4 of the states would adopt? It's a fair question. If it's perceived that this convention is too far left or too far right, how could 3/4 of the states then ratify the proposed amendments coming out of that convention? Fair question. I just suggest that it would be best to have a convention that only deals with specific questions, and so that the debate within the convention could be limited, isn't the right word, but could be disciplined in a way that they could come up with a reasoned decision whether to propose amendments or not.
One of the other issues that I heard, I believe, Micah Kubik say was that there's no rule on how the delegates would be elected or selected.
May I address that just momentarily? And I'll briefly introduce myself. I'm David Copeland. I'm the state director for Kansas Convention of States. And I really applaud you for having this seminar because both sides need to understand the facts. And Professor Johnson has done a very faithful job of presenting the facts of constitutional law and the history. Your question was the rules.
Sorry.
Right now, legislators, not necessarily ALEC legislators, but legislators are drafting rules that would apply to the selection of delegates or commissioners to any convention of states. And that's going on in all of the states that are actively addressing the Convention of States.
Okay, thank you. Let me address one thing that might be relevant to that, and that is, for many, many years, there was a sense among scholars that the ratification of the Constitution that, after 1787 was not based on the feelings and opinions of the people, and that at the time, maybe more than half of the population in the United States actually, if there were reliable opinion polling, would have expressed opposition to the Constitution. But recently there has been very interesting scholarship that points out that the conventions, that the ratification process did not allow the state legislatures to vote on the Constitution. Rather, it required that state conventions be convened to vote on state ratification. One point there being, of course, that the states were giving up significant powers to this newly created federal government, and it would be more unlikely that state legislators, if elected officials, would agree to give up those powers. And so the writers of the Constitution came up with this innovative process of having state conventions rather than the legislatures do it. And in nearly all of the states, they actually elected the members of the state convention. And so the scholars that now look at it say now is that the people who stood for election to the conventions either said, I'm for this Constitution or I'm against it. And so the electorate had the ability to decide to vote for people who were in favor of the Constitution. So in fact, it does appear that there was popular support, more popular support for the Constitution because it was ratified by all the states. In some states by very close votes, but it was still ratified by the states, state conventions that had been elected, not appointed. And so that might lead to the conclusion that whatever rules are put into place should include some sort of popular vote for the people who represent the states at this convention.
I had one here, and I don't know if this was a double one, because you already said, or maybe it was yeah. Who is Alec? Well, again, they are legislators who favor more a certain set of goals, and who give more power to corporations generally, and more wealth to the wealthy, as we might see from our recent tax laws.
Cannot hear you.
The question that I was just handed, and by the way, there's one that I would like to address. Somebody, Jeffrey Penland, said that Citizens United has nothing to do with the First Amendment. I'd be happy to talk with you about that. Here's a question that's very interesting, just came in. With the current practice of gerrymandering voting districts to skew the representation of specific parties in state legislatures and disenfranchisement of voters in Kansas, so forth and so on. Let's see, the selected representatives from Kansas must not reflect the actual will of the people of Kansas. Interestingly enough, Kansas today is the least gerrymandered state in the Union. And why is that? Because in 2012, after the state legislature had been unable to disagree on the congressional, had been unable to agree. Did I say disagree? I'm sorry. Boy, that's very confusing. In 2011, the legislature had been unable to agree on the congressional, state senate, state legislature, and state board of education district lines. By tradition in Kansas, the State House would draw its lines, the State Senate would draw its lines, and then each house would defer to the other. They would rubber stamp the other's district lines. And it was embodied in a piece of legislation that the governor would then sign. That didn't happen in 2011. So in 2012, as required by federal law, the drawing of those lines went to a federal court. And in that trial, it took place, I remember distinctly, it started the day after Memorial Day in 2012. A three-judge federal panel drew the district lines for Kansas. And so if you look at the lines the districts that we've had since 2012, all of the gerrymandering that had been in place in Kansas, such as dividing Lawrence quite literally in two, between the 2nd and 3rd congressional districts, north-south along Iowa Street, all of that was removed. You have to look to other states, Pennsylvania, Texas, North Carolina, and Maryland, to see real gerrymandering by both parties. Maryland was done by the Democrats, Pennsylvania and North Carolina by the Republicans. It's sort of an equal opportunity violation of our, I suppose you say, tenets of fair representation. The party in control, the party in power, sets the rules of the game. That's the way it's been in politics in the United States since time immemorial. Gerrymandering is a huge problem. There are two essential bases for gerrymandering. One is racial, which is clearly illegal. It's a violation of the Constitution. It's a violation of federal statutes. No question whatsoever. And then there's the phenomenon that we've been seeing more and more of recently, and that's partisan or political gerrymandering, where you see district lines drawn to perpetuate the control of the party in power. The Supreme Court has had difficulty dealing with those cases, coming up with what they view as a test that they can apply. A couple of cases went to the Supreme Court this year, one from Wisconsin, one from North Carolina, actually I should say three, and also the Maryland case. And the Supreme Court kicked them back because the lower courts, they said, didn't make sufficient findings on whether the challengers to these district lines had appropriate standing. The states are actually taking care of that already. These cases will be back at the Supreme Court in the next year or two, and hopefully we'll have some guidance from the court as to how we should deal with partisan gerrymandering.